Hi there, this is attorney Candice Carr with Ouellette, Carr and Spectrum Title Services. This is the first video in our series on the new closing disclosure form. And this video is going to go over the top 10 things that agents should know about the new closing disclosure. So first things first, a new closing statement form called the closing disclosure, or CD, which is how you'll see it referred to through most of the video, will be used for most loan applications taken for new mortgages effective on October 3rd, 2015. So we're not going to see the closing statement as of October 3rd. It applies to loan applications taken as of October 3rd. So we'll likely start to see it into November. The lender, not the closing agent, may be preparing and delivering the closing disclosure. We're going to have to see how this plays out. Some of our sources have indicated that a lot of the big lenders have said that they will be preparing the closing disclosure and sending it to closing agents. Closing disclosure must be delivered to the buyer consumer at least 3 business days prior to the scheduled closing date. The closing agent must get information to the lender approximately 10 to 14 days prior to the closing date for completion of the CD to meet the delivery requirement. So you as the agents will need to communicate to the closing agent all your buyer paid charges 10 to 14 days prior to closing date. And how are you going to handle this communication? You need to have a system in place to get the information on buyer paid charges to the closing agent so we can in turn get it to the lender and keep everything on schedule. The closing agent will need your real estate company's state license number and your individual real estate license number for the new CD form. I suggest you get in the habit of putting these on the contract. That way it's not something that we have to ask for after the fact or that you have to provide after the fact. If you just get in the habit of putting those numbers on the contract, then that's one less thing you'll have to worry about. The closing disclosure sent to the buyer consumer won't include the seller side of the transaction. This is only for the buyer. The closing agent, not the lender, is responsible for completing and delivering the seller side of the closing disclosure. So the form that the lender sends out will not have any seller side charges on it. Closing agent may decide to prepare a separate closing disclosure for the seller. Again, we'll have to see how this all plays out when in action and determine what is the most efficient way for preparing the seller side and possibly the buyer side. I mean, we as the closing agent will be preparing the buyer side in some instances. That's just going to be a decision that the lender is going to make. You likely will not receive an advance copy of the closing disclosure before it's delivered to the buyer. The lender will likely send the closing disclosure to the closing agent when it's sent to the buyer consumer. The settlement agent will not be permitted to send a copy to real estate agents. You will need to obtain a copy from the borrower. And that's one thing that has been pointed out time and time again, is that this is for the borrower's eyes only unless they want to send it out to somebody else. We are not permitted to send it to anybody except for the borrower. Changes to the closing disclosure after delivery to the buyer consumer may trigger a new 3-day waiting period. If changes cause the APR to be inaccurate, the buyer changes a loan product, or a prepayment penalty is added. Changes and adjustments affecting the value of the property as determined by the lender may trigger additional disclosure and review periods under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, controlling the delivery of the appraisals. You may want to consider 2 pre-settlement inspections or walkthroughs. Example, a first inspection 7 to 10 days in advance of closing, and a second inspection on the day of closing, because we will be working with a waiting period essentially. Review and become familiar with the closing disclosure so that you can answer buyer and seller questions. Note the closing disclosure refers to owner's title insurance as optional in some circumstances. Now we have a video already recorded and sent out on title insurance and what it is and the importance of it, and we are happy to talk with buyers. I don't want to get into the details of how it's going to be put on the closing disclosure, but they essentially want us to show the full amount of a lender's policy as opposed to an owner's policy. So it's going to be a little bit confusing. Again, we're going to just have to see how it all works out. Obtain appropriate advice for the buyer on protections given to them through owner's title insurance. Well, you don't have to do this. You can just direct them right to our video, and that gives them an explanation on what it is and why they need it. The new triad rules may affect the contract terms that you help negotiate for either buyer or the seller. Triad stands for TILA RESPA Integrated Disclosures. TILA meaning Truth in Lending Act, RESPA Integrated Disclosures. For example, closing 30 days out may no longer be realistic. If your contract form contains a set number of days for the closing to occur, then a minimum of 15 additional days may be advisable. If your contract form requires you to fill in a specific date, take additional time into consideration. It's important for you to communicate with the lender and closing agent to determine a realistic time frame for closings under these new rules. We've all gotten kind of accustomed to 45-day-ish closing time frame when we're dealing with a mortgage closing, but now we do have some additional days in there that is going to cause potentially longer than that. So just keep all this in mind, and this is something that's going to have to be explained to everybody. Now, what system do you have in place to communicate changes to the contract after it's been signed to the lender? Consider having a conversation with buyers about their need to respond immediately to lender requests, and remind the seller they must follow the contract to the letter because not doing so may delay the closing. Like we talked about earlier, there are some things that could trigger a new waiting period, so we all need to keep on a very specific time frame and make sure the lender has all the information they need. Now, we've provided a link on our website where you can go, and we have a list of the things that we just went over in a very easy printable handout, so you can have it with you, start to review it now. That way you're very familiar with what you as agents should be responsible for and what you should be thinking about when we're dealing with the new closing disclosure. So you can go there, Spectrum Title LLC /CD handouts, and download and print everything that we just talked about. And please do not forget to register for our September 1st webinar on the closing disclosure. I'm sure a lot of you have probably not even seen the form yet. We will be going through the form. You can see what it looks like. It looks very different from a HUD for the most part, so you can start to familiarize yourself with it. We'll go through and explain it and talk about some of the more important things that you need to know in addition to what we just went over. My phone number and my email address is there. If you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate to contact me. And the link to register for the webinar is in the email that you received with this video. So you just click on that link that says register now. It's very easy. It'll take you right to the page, and you just put in your name and email address, and we hope to see you there. And thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.